Right now, as you listen to this, you are spending nearly half of your waking life in a universe that, well, it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, you are living inside this, like, bespoke, invisible operating system constructed entirely by your own biology.
Right.
And the most dangerous cognitive illusion you carry, really, the one we all carry, is this quiet, absolute certainty that the person sitting next to you on the train, or across from you at the dinner table, is running that exact same software.
Oh, completely. We just constantly project our own internal architecture onto everyone else.
Exactly.
Like if your mind is this loud, constantly talking radio station, you just assume your spouse's mind is a radio station too.
Yeah, you wouldn't even question it.
Or, if your mind is a silent, high-definition movie theater, you assume that's just what human consciousness is for everyone.
Because it's all you've ever known.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, for the better part of a century, even the most brilliant minds in science fell for this exact same projection.
They really did.
The scientific community essentially built an entire discipline on the assumption that the internal mental lives of human beings were, well, uniform.
Which is why I want to welcome you to this session of Audio Notebook, because today we are going to completely dismantle that assumption.
We really are.
We're mapping the invisible architecture of your mind and the minds of everyone around you, from the literal biological wiring of your internal voice to, the exact evolutionary reason why your mind wanders during a boring meeting.
It's a full deconstruction of the private universe you live in.
Totally. But to understand how radical this mapping is, we have to look at how completely the scientific establishment just, failed to understand this for decades.
Oh, it was a massive blind spot.
Back in the early 20th century, the prevailing psychological model, especially the behaviorist movement, driven by figures like John B. Watson, they decided to just ignore the inner mind entirely.
Yeah, they literally called it a black box that wasn't worth opening.
Which seems insane now.
I know, but you have to understand the context. The behaviorists were just obsessed with making psychology a rigorous, hard science, like comparable to physics or chemistry.
Right, they wanted hard numbers.
Exactly. Watson basically argued that if you can't measure a thought with a stopwatch or a ruler, it just has no place in a laboratory.
So they only cared about what they could see.
Right. The physical stimulus that went into the organism and the physical behavior that came out, the whole dark room of the mind, the subjective experience happening between the stimulus and the response, they just dismissed it as unscientific territory.
They basically threw out the defining feature of human existence just to make the math look cleaner.
That's exactly what they did. It was a huge epistemological failure.
Which brings us to the fundamental wall that cognitive science eventually had to hit, right? The hard problem of consciousness.
Yes, the big one.
Because mapping the mind isn't just about identifying which part of the brain lights up when you hear a bell. We can do that now with an fMRI machine.
Right, but those are what philosophers and neuroscientists refer to as the easy problems.
And easy feels like a very loaded word when we're talking about mapping billions of firing neurons.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the easy problems of cognitive science involve understanding biological mechanisms and functions.
Like the physical wiring.
Yeah, like how does the auditory cortex physically discriminate between the high pitch of a flute and, say, the low rumble of a bass drum?
Or how the visual system focuses attention on a moving object while blurring the background.
Exactly. Or how the motor neurons trigger the vocal cords so we can verbally report that we're hungry. These are phenomenally complex biological processes, but conceptually, they're straightforward.
Right, you can trace the path.
We can approach them through traditional scientific observation. We track the blood flow, measure the action potentials, trace the physical data.
It's pure mechanics. It's like taking the casing off a computer and understanding the hardware. You can point to the motherboard, the RAM, the processor, and watch the binary code flipping from 0 to 1.
That's a great analogy.
You can explain exactly how the machine processes information. But the hard problem asks a completely different question, which is, why does all that physical, biological processing actually feel like something?
And that is the crux of it. The hard problem is about the qualitative, subjective, first-person experience attached to those neurons firing.
What philosophers call qualia.
Yes, qualia. It's the what it is like factor. What is it like to taste the sharp salinity of an oyster? Or to see the exact, heartbreaking shade of a winter sunset?
Or feeling the sudden, sharp sting of a paper cut.
Right. You can map the exact pain receptors in the finger and the neural pathways shooting up the spinal cord to the brain, but tracing that electrical signal doesn't explain the private, internal sensation of the pain itself.
You cannot put the feeling of a paper cut under a microscope.
Exactly. If the easy problems are about understanding the computer's hardware, the hard problem is trying to explain what the operating system's interface actually feels like to use from the perspective of the machine itself.
And what modern cognitive science is finally realizing is that humanity isn't all running on Mac OS or Windows.
No, not at all.
Everyone is running a completely different, highly customized, proprietary operating system.
And to give you a sense of just how vast this internal operating system is, we have to look at a foundational statistic that really frames everything we are exploring today.
Lay on me.
The average human spends approximately 47% of their waking hours in stimulus-independent thought.
Just wow. Let's just pause and consider the weight of that metric.
It's massive, nearly half of our conscious existence.
If you are awake for 16 hours a day, for almost 8 of those hours, you are entirely checked out of your immediate physical reality.
Right, you are not truly interacting with the sensory environment around you.
You might be staring at a spreadsheet or, gripping the steering wheel of your car, but your consciousness is living entirely inside a simulation generated by your own brain.
Essentially, half of human history has happened entirely inside human heads.
That's so trippy.
And this brings us to a concept known as the idiosyncrasy principle.
Okay, what is that?
Well, because you spend half your life immersed in your specific internal world, your brain naturally concludes that your world is the default human condition.
Which makes sense, logically.
It does. But the idiosyncrasy principle proves that the transfer function between the physical world and our subjective experience is totally structurally unique to every single individual.
So, you and I could be standing shoulder to shoulder in a gallery looking at the exact same oil painting. The physical photons bouncing off the canvas and hitting our retinas are identical.
But your internal reality in that exact millisecond, the specific chaotic blend of voices, memories, visual associations, and physical sensations that the painting triggers in your mind is fundamentally different from mine.
We are occupying the same physical room, but we are effectively navigating completely different universes.
Which is a beautiful, poetic idea, but it presents a massive logistical nightmare for a scientist.
Oh, I bet. If consciousness is invisible, and if we are all living in private universes, how do we actually get reliable data on this?
Exactly. Introspection is notoriously unreliable. The second you try to turn around and look at your own thoughts, they vanish or they mutate.
It's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle applied to the mind.
That's a perfect way to put it. The very act of observing the phenomenon changes the phenomenon.
So how did researchers get past that? That sounds like a brick wall.
That was the methodological brick wall that replaced the behaviorist's blind spot. If you bring a subject into a sterile laboratory and ask them to sit in a chair and tell you what they're thinking, their brain's executive functions immediately step in.
They start editing.
Exactly. They start curating a narrative that makes them sound rational, or they try to give the researcher the answer they think is expected.
You get a highly polished PR statement from the brain, not the raw data.
Right. To break through this wall, a psychologist named Russell Hurlburt pioneered a radical methodology called descriptive experience sampling, or DES.
The goal of DES is to capture what Hurlburt beautifully termed pristine inner experience, right?
Yes, pristine inner experience.
I just love that phrase. It implies catching the thought in its wild habitat right before the brain's editor-in-chief redlines it and translates it for an audience. But how does DES actually trap something so fleeting?
By relying on pure randomness and absolute immediacy.
Okay, how so?
The methodology takes the subject out of the lab and puts them back into their actual life. Subjects wear a specialized programmed beeper as they go about their days, riding the bus, cooking dinner, sitting in a dull meeting.
Just living normal life.
Yeah. And the beeper is designed to go off at completely random, unpredictable intervals.
Okay.
The subject is given one strict instruction. The very millisecond you hear that beep, you must freeze your internal experience.
Just freeze it.
You have to immediately jot down exactly what was happening in your mind in that precise microsecond. Not what you were thinking 30 seconds ago, and not what you think you should have been thinking about.
Just that pristine, unedited snapshot.
Exactly. And because it's completely random, the brain cannot prepare a defense mechanism.
You can't curate a thought if you don't know when the audit is happening.
Right. Following these random captures, researchers conduct intensive, highly structured interviews within 24 hours to unpack the geometry of those exact micro moments.
And what did they find when they analyzed all this?
When researchers analyzed thousands upon thousands of these pristine sampled moments across diverse populations, the old assumption of a uniform, standard human mind completely collapsed.
Just fell apart entirely.
The data revealed a taxonomy of the mind. They identified 5 distinct modalities that make up the vast majority of human inner experience. They refer to this as the 5FP, the 5 phenomena.
No, it is crucial to understand that these are not rigid, isolated buckets, right?
Right. They are fluid. They bleed into one another, layer on top of each other, and shift dynamically based on what the brain is trying to accomplish. But they represent the fundamental elements of our internal chemistry.
Okay, so let's break them down. What's the first pillar of the 5FP?
The first pillar is inner speaking. This is the internalized verbal dialogue or narration.
The classic voice in the head.
Yep. The data shows that roughly 30 to 50% of individuals experience this as a frequent daily reality. Across the entire population, it appears in about 20 to 28% of all sampled pristine moments.
Wow. Okay, what's the second pillar?
The second pillar is inner seeing. This is mental visual imagery.
So pictures in your head.
Right. It can range from faint, ghostly silhouettes to full-blown, photorealistic cinematic scenes. About 50% of people rely heavily on this visual architecture, and it accounts for roughly 25% of sampled moments.
That's fascinating. And the third?
The third pillar is unsymbolized thinking, which is often the most counterintuitive concept for people to grasp.
Oh, absolutely. This one breaks my brain a little bit.
It's tough. This is a clear, distinct thought or meaning that contains absolutely no words, no images, and no sensory elements whatsoever. It's pure, raw cognition, and it makes up another 25% of sampled moments.
We will absolutely dedicate time to unpacking that later because trying to conceptualize a thought without words or pictures is just wild.
You definitely will. The fourth pillar is feelings.
Okay, like emotions.
Yes, but this is not a cognitive thought about an emotion like thinking I am sad. It is the direct, raw, physiological experience of an emotional state or mood in that exact moment.
Just pure feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that also accounts for roughly 25% of the data.
Okay, and the final pillar.
Finally, we have sensory awareness. This is a heightened, directed focus on specific sensory details, either from the internal body or the external world, completely divorced from any cognitive judgment about it.
Can you give an example?
It's the pure sensation of the steering wheel's texture against your palm, or the specific temperature of the air hitting your face. And this rounds out the final 25% of the sampled moments.
It's like we've mapped the periodic table of consciousness.
It really is.
And I want to use this taxonomy as a springboard to dive deeply into that first pillar because it is the modality that Hollywood, literature, and general culture overwhelmingly assume we all share, the voice.
Inner speaking.
Right. We live in a society built entirely on language, so we naturally privilege the internal monologue. But the biological mechanics of how that voice actually gets inside our heads are fascinating. We aren't born with it, are we?
Not at all. The voice is constructed. The leading developmental model for this comes from Lev Vygotsky, a pioneering Soviet psychologist.
Okay, what was his theory?
Vygotskian theory proposes that inner speech is actually the endpoint of a long developmental process called internalization.
Internalization. Walk us through that.
Think about observing a toddler playing with blocks. They don't sit in silence, strategizing their next move internally. They use social speech. They talk out loud to their parents or caregivers, narrating their actions.
Right, like, I'm building a tall tower now. Everything is an outward broadcast.
Exactly. Then, as they mature slightly, they transition to a phase Vygotsky called private speech. You will see a 4-year-old playing completely alone in a room, just talking out loud to themselves.
Put the red block here. No, the blue one goes on top.
Yes. They are using external spoken language as a tool to regulate their own behavior and solve complex spatial tasks.
They literally have to physically hear the instructions entering their own ears to process the logic of the action.
Over years of neural development, that external private speech slowly retreats. It goes silent.
It moves inside.
The child learns to execute those same linguistic commands without engaging the lungs, the vocal cords, or the tongue. The physical act of speaking is internalized into silent, subjective thought. The voice in your head is quite literally the ghost of the toddler talking to their toys.
That is an incredible way to visualize it. But when we look at the adults who do maintain a frequent inner voice, that 30 to 50% of the population, we find that the voice isn't just one monolithic narrator, right?
Oh, far from it. Researchers use a tool called the VISQ, the Varieties of Inner Speech Questionnaire, to break down the acoustics of this internal world.
And what do they find?
The most common variation, reported by over 75% of sampled students, is dialogic inner speech.
Dialogic, so a dialogue.
Right. It's not a single voice reading a monologue, it is an active conversation. People will routinely split their consciousness to adopt multiple perspectives.
Like playing devil's advocate against their own ideas.
Or they will painstakingly rehearse a difficult conversation they need to have with their boss later that afternoon.
It's a mental flight simulator powered by language. If I say X, he will counter with Y, and then I'll deploy Z. You map the entire conversational decision tree before you ever step into the office.
Exactly. Alongside that, we see evaluative inner speech, which is present in about 82.5% of people who utilize an inner voice.
What is that?
This is the voice of self-valuation. It functions as either the critical judge or the motivational coach. Come on, focus, you can do this. Or, that was a ridiculous thing to say at the party.
Let's look at the implications of that evaluative voice, because it seems like a dangerous piece of software to leave running in the background.
It can be, absolutely.
On paper, having an internal coach makes us great at problem solving, planning, and metacognition, thinking about our own thinking. But isn't this evaluative voice the exact same mechanism that tortures us?
Yes, unfortunately.
The voice that keeps you awake at 2 a.m., looping endlessly over a minor social faux pas from 3 years ago?
It is a profound vulnerability in the system. Individuals who rely heavily on verbal thinking have an undeniable advantage in sequential planning. But clinical research paints a stark picture of the dark side of high-frequency, evaluative inner speech.
When it turns negative.
When that evaluative dialogue turns inherently negative, it becomes a trap. It is closely, positively associated with poor emotion regulation, high trait anxiety, and significantly lower levels of global self-esteem.
The simulator gets stuck on a nightmare loop.
And because it's generating language, the brain processes it as an ongoing, present threat.
Wow. The VISQ also identifies a spectrum of condensed versus expanded inner speech, right?
Yes. Expanded speech is when your internal voice uses full, grammatically correct sentences, complete with punctuation and syntax.
And condensed?
Condensed speech is a fascinating neurological shorthand. It's where a single, internalized word carries the semantic weight of a whole paragraph because your brain already deeply understands the context.
It's like texting yourself using hyper-compressed abbreviations.
Exactly. And perhaps the most unsettling category identified by the VISQ is the phenomenon of other people.
Wait, hearing other people in your head.
Yes. This is where the inner voice isn't yours at all. It is the distinct internalized voice of a specific individual, a demanding parent, a former mentor, a highly critical teacher.
Oh, wow.
You literally hear their specific linguistic cadence and tone operating as your own internal narrator. High frequencies of hearing other people are very strongly linked to chronic trait anxiety.
Because you are essentially carrying someone else's judgment around as your baseline operating system.
Exactly.
To carry the voice of a critic inside your own skull is haunting. But it raises a deeply mechanical question for me.
Which is?
When we experience this inner speech, it feels incredibly localized. Like when I think in words, it physically feels like the sound is happening right behind my forehead. What is actually happening in the biological hardware to create that sensation?
That spatial illusion is one of the brain's most brilliant neurological magic tricks. Inner speech is overwhelmingly localized in the left hemisphere of the brain.
Okay.
We initially mapped this geography through historical case studies of aphasia patients who suffered targeted brain damage, usually from strokes, and lost the ability to speak or comprehend language.
Through these tragedies, neuroscientists isolated two critical regions, right?
Yes. Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
Broca and Wernicke, break those down.
Broca's area is located in the inferior frontal gyrus. It functions as the ultimate hub for speech production. It unifies the syntactic rules of language, the semantic meaning of the words, and the mnemonic memory required to string them together.
It formulates the blueprint for articulation.
Right. Wernicke's area, located in the posterior superior temporal lobe, is the engine of comprehension. It parses the incoming auditory data to extract meaning.
And they are connected.
Yes, these two distinct regions are connected by a massive, high-speed bundle of white matter nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus.
It's like a biological fiber optic cable, ensuring the speechwriter in the frontal lobe and the speech listener in the temporal lobe are in constant, instantaneous communication.
Exactly. Now, here is the wild part. When you engage in silent inner speech, just thinking words to yourself without moving a single muscle in your jaw or throat, these exact language regions in the left hemisphere activate at an astounding 60% of the intensity of actually speaking out loud.
Wait, let's anchor that concept. 60%. Just think quietly to yourself.
The metabolic and neurological tax is enormous. Your brain is running the exact same complex motor and auditory algorithms required to physically move your lungs, tighten your vocal cords, and shape your tongue. But at the very last microsecond, it suppresses the final motor output command.
It revs the engine but keeps the car in park.
And because your auditory cortex is being intensely stimulated by these internal signals, your brain processes it as actual sound. It creates the inescapable spatial illusion that a voice is echoing localized inside your head.
Language is an incredibly expensive program for the human brain to run, which makes me wonder about the inverse.
What do you mean?
If the internal voice is this huge, taxing, anxiety-inducing simulator that demands massive amounts of energy, what happens if you just don't have it? What if the left hemisphere is just quiet?
Then you belong to one of the most exciting new frontiers in modern cognitive science,
Then endophasia.
an endophasia.
Yeah.
This is the newly coined clinical term for the absence or near total absence of inner speech.
The silent mind.
For a remarkably long time, the scientific community essentially gaslit these individuals.
Really?
Yeah, researchers just didn't believe a functioning human could exist without an internal monologue. But in 2024, a landmark study published by cognitive researchers Johan Nedergaard and Gary Lupian finally quantified this silent demographic.
And what did they find?
They proved that for people with an endophasia, thought is a rich, complex stream of concepts, images, and raw feelings. But there is absolutely zero linguistic narrative carrying it. The operating system has no text interface.
How does a person without an internal voice function in a society that is almost entirely structured around verbal communication? Like, how do you plan your grocery list or memorize a phone number, read a novel if there is no voice reading it back to you?
Nedergaard and Lupian sought to answer exactly that. Does the absence of an inner voice create measurable behavioral consequences?
So they tested them.
Yes. They designed a series of ingenious cognitive tasks, comparing a cohort of people with high inner speech to a cohort with anendophasia. The results definitively prove that silent thinkers operate at a distinct disadvantage in specific tasks traditionally supported by internal language loops.
Let's break down the methodology of those tasks. The rhyme judgment test they used is brilliant in its simplicity.
It really is. The researchers would show a participant a picture of an object, for instance, a picture of a sock, and right next to it, a picture of a clock.
There are no words on the screen, just the visual images.
Right. The researcher then asks, do the names of these two objects rhyme?
To solve that puzzle, a verbal thinker instinctively translates the images into language. You see the image, your brain generates the silent word sock, you hold it in your working memory, you generate the silent word clock, and then you use your internal auditory cortex to listen to the two mental words to see if the phonetics match.
Exactly. Now, individuals with an endophasia struggled significantly with this exact task.
Because they couldn't hear the words.
Yes. They were notably slower to respond, and their accuracy rates plummeted. They perfectly understand the concept of a sock, and they know what a clock is. Their semantic understanding is flawless.
But the auditory linguistic carrier, the mental sound of the word, simply isn't there to examine. They cannot mentally hear the rhyme.
The researchers also tested verbal working memory, the classic test of remembering a sequence of random words.
And how did that go?
Well, if you ask a typical verbal thinker to remember a string of numbers or unrelated words, they utilize a process called subvocal rehearsal.
Just repeating the list over and over in your inner voice.
Right, creating an auditory loop to keep the data alive in their working memory. And endophasics do not possess that internal mental scratch pad, so their recall capacity for sequential linguistic data drops significantly.
But if they are failing at these fundamental linguistic memory tasks, how do they survive? Do they just constantly drop the ball in daily life?
The human brain is infinitely adaptable, and Nedergaard and Lupian uncovered the compensatory strategies these individuals use.
What do they do?
The researchers tweaked the parameters of the test. They asked the anendophasic individuals to physically speak the words out loud during the rhyme test and the memory test. The moment they were allowed to use their physical vocal cords, their performance instantly skyrocketed to match the control group perfectly. The deficit vanished.
Wow. So the underlying cognitive machinery is perfectly intact. They just have to externalize the process.
Exactly. To navigate a verbally biased world, they rely heavily on externalization. They might speak out loud to themselves more frequently, rely on extensive written notes, or use physical markers in their environment.
The processing power is there. The internal medium is just bypassed.
And crucially, when the researchers tested them on cognitive tasks that do not rely on language like rapid task switching or complex visual discrimination, their performance was completely identical to, and sometimes better than, the verbal thinkers.
Which provides the perfect conceptual bridge to the second great pillar of our internal architecture. If the left hemisphere is the domain of the voice, we need to shift our focus to the domain of the image.
Inner seeing.
Yes, the mind's eye. Let's explore the visual spectrum of consciousness.
As we noted in the 5FP data, the vast majority of humanity possesses some degree of intuitive mental imagery. To quantify this, psychologists rely on the VVIQ, the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire.
How does that work?
It prompts you to imagine specific scenarios, like a sunrise over a horizon or the specific contours of a relative's face, and asks you to rate the clarity, color, and stability of the resulting mental image.
Let's look at the exact population prevalence based on the most recent data, because the distribution across the spectrum is fascinating.
According to highly comprehensive 2024 data published by Wright and colleagues, the overwhelming majority of the human population, roughly 89.7 to 89.9%, falls squarely into the typical imagery category.
They possess a mid-range vividness. The images they summon aren't perfectly photorealistic, but they are clearly defined, colored, and useful for spatial reasoning.
Right. But the standard distribution curve has extremes, and the extremes are where the architecture gets truly bizarre.
Let's start at the lower bound.
Approximately 3.0 to 3.3% of the global population lives with hypophantasia.
Hypophantasia.
Their voluntary mental images are incredibly dim, vague, or structurally unstable. It's often described as trying to look at a shape through heavily frosted moving glass.
And then at the absolute bottom of the spectrum.
Accounting for roughly 0.9 to 1.2% of the population, we find aphantasia.
The completely blind mind's eye.
A total, absolute absence of voluntary visual imagery. If you instruct an aphantasic to picture a bright red apple resting on a wooden table, they comprehend the semantic properties of the apple. They know it is red, round, and has a stem, but their internal visual field remains completely dark.
They see absolutely nothing behind their eyelids.
Nothing.
This raises a massive question about self-awareness for me. If roughly 1 in 100 people has a completely blind mind's eye, how is it possible to go 20, 30, or 40 years of your life without realizing your brain is missing a foundational feature that almost everyone else possesses?
It is shockingly common. In fact, aphantasia was only officially defined and recognized as a distinct cognitive variation in the medical literature in 2015.
2015, that's yesterday.
I know, following groundbreaking research by Professor Adam Zeman. And the reason it remained hidden in plain sight for all of human history goes right back to the idiosyncrasy principle.
We implicitly trust our own operating system.
Exactly. Aphantasics grow up assuming that common cultural phrases like picture this in your mind or see it in your mind's eye are merely figurative, poetic metaphors.
They assume the rest of us are just using colorful language to describe the act of thinking really hard about the facts of a thing.
Exactly. The realization is often a profound ontological shock. It usually happens in their 20s or 30s during a random conversation when an aphantasic suddenly realizes that other people are literally projecting full-color, three-dimensional holograms inside their skulls.
That would shatter your understanding of human experience.
It really does. But the neurology of aphantasia contains a fascinating contradiction because the visual system isn't actually broken.
What do you mean?
It is a highly specific structural dissociation. Aphantasics lack voluntary imagery. The conscious, top-down neural pathway, the ability of the frontal cortex to demand an image from the visual cortex on command, is severed or heavily dampened.
But they can still dream, right?
Yes. However, many aphantasics still experience incredibly vivid, fully rendered visual dreams while they sleep.
So the projector works perfectly fine, the bulb is bright, the lens is focused, they just don't possess the remote control while they are awake.
The bottom-up, involuntary generation of imagery that occurs during REM sleep utilizes a different neural pathway, and that pathway is fully intact. But because they lack that conscious waking projector, they do suffer highly specific cognitive deficits.
Like what?
Aphantasia is strongly correlated with deficits in autobiographical memory.
Because they lack the ability to visually replay their own past. When a typical thinker remembers their 10th birthday party, they pull up a visual scene. They see the color of the frosting on the cake, the layout of the living room, the faces of their friends. It's a sensory immersion.
Right. An aphantastic just remembers a bulleted list of facts about the event. Consequently, they also frequently report struggles with facial recognition.
Oh, that makes sense.
They cannot hold a visual template of a person's face in their working memory to compare against the physical face of the person standing in front of them. They rely on semantic markers, a specific haircut, a distinctive pair of glasses to recognize people out of context.
If aphantasia is the dark end of the spectrum, what does the upper extreme look like?
The upper extreme is hyperphantasia, representing about 5.9 to 6.1% of the population.
And what's that like?
For these individuals, internal mental imagery is so staggeringly vivid, so richly detailed and stable, that it can occasionally be indistinguishable from actual physical sight. It is a persistent, high-definition, photo-like reality.
Let's map the biology of this visual hardware. How does the brain physically generate a picture out of nothing?
Visual thought is anchored in the occipital lobe, specifically the primary visual cortex, known as V1, located right at the back of the skull. When a concept triggers an image, the visual information is processed and splits into two distinct, highly specialized neural streams.
The dorsal stream and the ventral stream, right?
Yes. The dorsal stream routes upward into the parietal lobe. This is the where pathway. It is entirely responsible for spatial memory, object location, and geometry.
It creates the three-dimensional map of the environment.
Right. The ventral stream routes downward into the temporal lobe. This is the what pathway. It processes identity, color, texture, and complex object recognition.
So when you imagine a shiny red apple sitting on a specific corner of a wooden table,
Your brain is seamlessly integrating the what data from the ventral stream with the where data of the dorsal stream.
earlier, we discussed the brutal metabolic tax of the inner voice activating at 60% of the intensity of speaking out loud. What is the metabolic cost for the mind's eye to render these complex graphics?
This metric reveals a profound evolutionary asymmetry in human cognition. Generating visual imagination only requires about 35% of the neural activation of actual physical sight.
Wait, really? It costs almost half as much energy to see an image as it does to hear a word.
It is vastly more efficient, and this points to a deep biological truth. Visual and spatial processing is significantly older. It is much more primary to the evolution of the mammalian brain than language, which is a relatively recent, highly complex evolutionary add-on.
The visual engine has had millions of years more to optimize its code.
Exactly. And we see this asymmetry play out in real time when we put people in fMRI scanners.
Explain how the brain imaging shows that asymmetry.
If you ask a highly verbal thinker to use their inner voice, say, to silently recite a poem, the fMRI shows that they almost always involuntarily engage their visual cortex alongside the language centers.
The words naturally drag ghost images along with them.
Right. Verbal thinkers cannot easily turn off their visual imagery. But visual thinkers have a distinct capability. They can often suppress their internal linguistic narrative entirely, achieving total verbal silence while they manipulate complex spatial or analytical tasks.
The older, highly optimized visual system can run completely independently, while the newer linguistic system leans heavily on the older one for support.
Which sets up the ultimate case study for hyperphantasia and the absolute dominance of the visual system. We have to look at the internal architecture of Dr. Temple Grandin.
Oh, yes.
Dr. Grandin is a legendary figure in animal science, an incredibly successful engineer on the autism spectrum, and she's a product of the scientific community with one of the most articulate, granular descriptions of a hyperphantasic mind ever recorded.
She describes her internal operating system not as a voice, but as a vast video library.
Yes, she has explicitly stated that she does not think in language at all. To her, the concept of a word-based mind is completely baffling.
So how does she process language?
When she hears a spoken word or reads a written sentence, her brain bypasses semantic abstraction entirely. It instantly, automatically translates the language into full-color moving pictures. It's a direct translation to a cinema screen.
And this profound visual hardware allowed her to revolutionize the design of livestock handling facilities across the globe. She didn't design blueprints using abstract math and written specifications.
No, she literally built the facilities in her mind first. She used her ventral and dorsal streams as a high-powered, three-dimensional physics engine.
She could mentally walk through the digital twin of the facility in her head, rotate the structure, project exactly where the shadows would fall at 3:00 p.m. based on the angle of the sun, and spot the design flaws that would frighten the cattle, all before a single piece of steel was actually welded.
She was running complex CAD software using biological tissue. Her case highlights just how wildly divergent our cognitive tools can be and how specific variations can grant extraordinary specialized capabilities.
So, we have thoroughly mapped the voice, and we have mapped the eye, language, and imagery. But now we are wading into the deep end of the conceptual pool.
Like abstract stuff.
Exactly. We need to explore the abstract, the visceral, and the phenomena of cross-modal realities. Because I have to admit, I still struggle with the most elusive trait in the 5FP taxonomy, unsymbolized thinking.
It is deeply challenging for most people to conceptualize, precisely because it lacks the sensory handles we usually use to grab onto a thought.
How do you experience pure meaning without a word to carry it or a picture to represent it? The analogy I keep coming back to is that it's like trying to hold water without a cup. The water just slips through your fingers. How can a thought exist entirely naked?
The cup without water is a brilliant analogy, and it illustrates exactly why people struggle. We are so accustomed to the cup, the internal word or the mental image, that we falsely equate the cup with the water itself.
We think the word is the thought.
But the water, the pure semantic meaning, exists completely independently of the container. Unsymbolized thinking is the direct, explicit cognitive grasp of a complex concept without activating the auditory or visual cortices. The semantic network fires, but it doesn't bother to render the output into a sensory format.
Walk me through how that actually manifests in a pristine, sampled moment. Give me a scenario.
Okay, imagine you're walking out your front door, you lock it behind you, and suddenly you realize you forgot your car keys on the kitchen counter.
Happens all the time.
In that exact millisecond of realization, you don't necessarily hear your internal voice slowly enunciate, "I have forgotten my keys."
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily conjure a high-definition image of your keys sitting on the granite.
You just know.
Yes, you just know, with absolute instant cognitive clarity, the complex concept of keys forgotten must return. The data is fully downloaded, processed, and understood by the brain, but it hasn't been rendered into a JPEG or an MP3 file yet.
It's just the raw, executable code of the meaning. It's pure data transfer.
Yes. And the DES data proves that for 25% of sampled moments across the general population, people experience this pure, unsymbolized cognitive grasp. For those who experience it frequently, it is not vague or muddy. It is as distinct, specific, and recognizable as hearing a loud voice shout a warning.
That brings us to the final two elements of the 5FP, feelings and sensory awareness. These modalities pull us out of the realm of abstract floating concepts and anchor us violently into the visceral physical body.
Right. Feelings are exactly what they imply. The direct, raw, internal experience of an emotional state. A sudden jolt of panic tightening the chest, or a warm wave of contentment.
And sensory awareness.
Sensory awareness, however, is highly specific. It is a hyper-focused, consuming attention directed at a physical sensation, completely divorced from context or narrative. It is feeling the specific biting coldness of a glass of ice water against the palm of your hand without thinking I am thirsty or this glass is cold. It is just the pure sensation of temperature and pressure.
And just like visual imagery, the data shows that the prevalence of sensory awareness is not uniform, particularly when we look at atypical neurological populations, right?
Very true. The internal architecture shifts dramatically. In individuals on the autism spectrum, for example, sensory awareness can sometimes expand to occupy a massive majority of their sampled inner experience.
Really? How much?
In specific cases, it accounts for nearly 100% of their sampled moments, completely overriding any inner speech, imagery, or abstract thought. Their entire internal reality becomes profoundly anchored in intense, localized sensory processing of the immediate environment.
Wow. And how does that architectural balance shift in conditions like schizophrenia?
In schizophrenia, the DS data often reveals profound distortions in sensory awareness. Patients frequently describe experiencing warped physical perceptions, or what they articulate as scratched visual and auditory inputs. The basic sensory data feed from the nervous system is being fundamentally altered and degraded before it ever reaches conscious awareness.
So we have these distinct lanes of processing: words, images, pure concepts, emotions, and raw sensory inputs. But what happens to the human experience when the guardrails between these distinct neurological lanes break down entirely?
It gets really interesting.
What happens when the biological wiring crosses over and the modalities crash into each other?
Then we enter the fascinating, almost psychedelic world of cross-modal realities, specifically the neurological condition known as synesthesia.
Synesthesia.
Yes, synesthesia occurs in roughly 2 to 5% of the global population. It is not an active choice or a learned association. It is automatic, it is highly consistent over an individual's entire lifetime, and it has a strong, identifiable genetic component.
So it's literally hardware.
Exactly. Synesthesia is essentially a benign short circuit in the brain's routing system, where a physical stimulus in one sensory modality involuntarily and instantaneously triggers a vivid, conscious experience in a completely different, unrelated sensory modality.
Give me the most prevalent examples of how these wires cross in daily life.
One of the most well-documented forms is chromesthesia. This is a condition where auditory sounds like musical notes, environmental noises, or human voices automatically trigger visual colors and shapes, which synesthetes refer to as photisms.
Photisms, okay.
So for a chrome state, hearing a C-sharp played on a piano might literally cause a sudden burst of shimmering blue light to appear in their visual field. The sound physically possesses the property of the color blue.
It sounds incredibly beautiful, like having a built-in visualizer for reality.
It is. Another highly prevalent variation is grapheme color synesthesia. This is where written letters or numbers possess inherent unchangeable colors.
Like A is red.
Exactly. The letter A is always a specific shade of crimson red. The number 4 is always a deep forest green. They don't just associate the color, they literally perceive the ink on the page as being that color. And what is truly remarkable is that neurological studies consistently confirm a significantly higher prevalence of synesthesia among artists, musicians, and creative professionals.
Their physical brains are literally biologically wired for cross-pollinating concepts.
Yes.
Blending letters and colors is mind-bending enough, but the research also details a phenomenon that feels dangerously close to science fiction. Vicarious sensation, the ability to physically mirror the bodies of other people.
Yes. The clinical term is vicarious touch. This phenomenon is driven by the brain's mirror neuron system. When you observe someone else performing a physical action or experiencing a physical sensation, your brain actually simulates that exact same action or sensation by firing in your own motor and somatosensory cortex.
I love the analogy we've used before for this. It is exactly like your brain's Bluetooth connection accidentally pairing to someone else's physical nervous system.
It is a profound lack of boundaries between the self and the other. And the truly staggering statistic here is the sheer overwhelming prevalence of this specific wiring.
How prevalent is it?
In a comprehensive study of a general undergraduate sample, researchers found that up to 84% of people experience some distinct form of vicarious physical sensation when watching someone else's body be touched or manipulated.
84%. Almost the entire population feels a physical echo of what they are visually witnessing.
Yes, the vast majority. And the data shows a notable gender split. About 88% of women report experiencing it, compared to 76% of men. For roughly a third of the overall population, this mirroring extends to vicarious pain.
Oh, vicarious pain.
Right. If they're watching a video and see someone slam their finger in a heavy car door, they don't just feel bad for them, they feel a distinct localized flash of pain in their own finger. The brain forcefully maps the visual trauma onto its own body map.
I think most people can relate to that sudden physical wince. You know, a sharp contraction in the gut or the shoulders when we see someone take a hard fall. But the research suggests this mirroring goes even deeper than just reacting to visual stimuli, right?
It goes much deeper. Approximately 15% of the population possesses a mirror neuron system so sensitive that they can trigger these physical sensations entirely internally just by thinking about them.
No visual input is required at all.
None. The research heavily correlates this specific ability with affective empathy. Affective empathy is the psychological and neurological capacity to literally, viscerally feel what others are feeling, rather than just cognitively understanding it on a spreadsheet.
So if they just imagine a touch.
If they observe or even imagine a pleasant, gentle touch, they feel warmth or a tingling sensation on their own skin. If they imagine a painful one, they feel sharp pressure. For these individuals, the neurological boundary between self and other is incredibly porous.
We have spent a massive amount of time mapping the qualitative nature of these internal universes. We've explored the shapes, the colors, the voices, the crossed wires. I want to shift our focus now because we need to talk about the sheer volume, velocity, and emotional gravity of this internal world. Let's quantify the mind and talk about the happiness deficit.
If we want to fully grasp the scale of the human internal experience, we have to look at the math of thought. Cognitive scientists have developed a quantitative projection metric known as thought density, mathematically represented by the Greek letter rho.
Break down the numbers for us. How fast is the biological machine actually running when we aren't paying attention?
Based on fMRI transition states and cognitive sampling, researchers estimate that the human brain generates anywhere from 6,000 to 60,000 distinct individual thoughts over the course of a single day.
60,000.
If we assume a standard 16-hour waking period, which equates to exactly 57,600 seconds, we can calculate the maximum cognitive density.
Wow.
At the high end of the spectrum, the human mind is pumping out roughly 1.04 thoughts every single second.
Every single second of your waking life, a new cognitive event is firing. Tick, thought, tick, thought, tick, thought.
It is continuous. It is relentless. The machine never stops generating output.
Which connects directly to our profound human tendency to drift. If my brain is pumping out a distinct thought every single second, where is all that mental energy going? Because I know for a fact I'm not having 1.04 profound, actionable thoughts about the email I'm trying to draft.
Right, no one is.
Mostly, those thoughts drift far away from the present moment.
And that biological drift brings us to the default mode network and the findings of the landmark 2010 Harvard Happiness Study conducted by psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert.
This is a huge study.
In terms of understanding the human condition, this is one of the most important pieces of psychological research published in the modern era. They utilized smartphone app sampling to track 2,250 adults as they went about their normal daily lives.
It was essentially the ultimate massive-scale DES beeper study.
Exactly. They pinged people randomly throughout the day, and they wanted to answer two fundamental questions. How often does the human mind wander away from the task it is currently performing? And exactly how does that mental wandering dictate our emotional state?
Let's reiterate the baseline statistic we opened the show with, because it originates directly from the massive data set of this specific study.
The data proved definitively that people's minds wander exactly 46.9% of their waking hours.
46.9%.
Stimulus-independent thought is not an anomaly, and it is not a sign of a distracted generation. It is the fundamental biological default mode of operation for the human brain.
And this wandering happens regardless of what we're physically doing, though the frequency fluctuates based on the context, correct?
Yes, there is significant contextual variation. The study found that the mind is anchored to the present moment most firmly and wanders least frequently during sex, where the mind-wandering rate drops to about 10%.
And at the other end.
Conversely, it wanders most frequently during rote, highly automated grooming activities, like taking a shower, brushing your teeth, or commuting on a familiar route, where the mind-wandering rate spikes to a staggering 65%.
Okay, here's the critical question that I guarantee everyone listening is asking themselves right now. Daydreaming is inherently enjoyable, right? If I am stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on a miserable Tuesday commute, shouldn't escaping into my own imagination to plan an upcoming weekend trip make me happier? Shouldn't a mental vacation be a protective, positive thing?
That was the entirely logical, universally held assumption before this data was published. But Killingsworth and Gilbert dropped an absolute bombshell on the field of psychology.
What did they find?
The emotional cost of mind wandering is shockingly severe. The data show that across the board, people are significantly less happy when their minds are wandering than when they are focused purely on the present moment. And here is the truly counterintuitive kicker. This dynamic remains true, even if the current physical task is deeply unenjoyable.
I need to make sure I'm understanding this. You are telling me that I am statistically, measurably happier being completely presently focused on the miserable, frustrating reality of a traffic jam than I am daydreaming about sitting on a tropical beach while my physical body sits in that traffic.
That is exactly what the data proves. The act of mind wandering itself is inherently detrimental to human happiness.
That is wild.
Now, as rigorous scientists, Killingsworth and Gilbert knew people would immediately argue about correlation versus causation. The obvious pushback is, maybe we mind wander because we are already unhappy. Maybe daydreaming is a symptom of trying to escape a pre-existing bad mood.
It's the classic chicken and the egg problem in psychological data.
To solve the chicken and the egg problem, they ran a highly complex time lag analysis on the thousands of smartphone data points. They would look at a person's reported mood at exactly 2:00 p.m. They would note whether their mind was wandering at 2:00 p.m. And then they would track that same person's mood 15 minutes later at 2:15 p.m.
And what did the time lag analysis show?
It definitively mathematically proved the causal direction. Mind wandering is the cause of unhappiness. It is not the consequence.
We need to unpack the biology of why that happens. Why does detaching from reality cause pain?
We have to look at the brain like an idling car engine, specifically the system called the default mode network. The evolutionary function of the default mode network is not to generate pleasant fantasies. Its primary function is threat detection, social simulation, and problem solving. It is a survival mechanism.
So it's looking for danger.
Yes. So when your brain isn't in gear performing a specific task, the engine doesn't just shut off and rest. It revs loudly on anxiety. It scans the horizon for predators that aren't there. It simulates future arguments that haven't happened. It ruthlessly ruminates on past mistakes. It worries about social status.
Left to its own devices, a drifting brain defaults to a state of anxious preparation.
Exactly. The study concluded that mind wandering accounts for approximately 10.8% of the total variance in human well-being.
10.8% might sound like a small, marginal number to someone outside of statistics, but in the realm of psychology and human behavior, that number is a titan, isn't it?
It is absolutely staggering. To put that 10.8% variance into proper perspective, it is more than double the impact of objective life circumstances.
Wait, really? Double?
Meaning, the chaotic, unmoored, drifting nature of your internal operating system dictates your daily happiness twice as much as your actual income bracket, your marital status, or your physical health combined.
Let's just sit with the gravity of that for a moment. The biological fact that you cannot keep your mind tethered to the present moment is destroying your happiness more efficiently than the actual objective miseries of your life.
It is a deeply sobering reality about the human condition. The machine we rely on to navigate the world is fundamentally biased toward generating anxiety when left in neutral.
Which makes me desperately want to pivot to a message of agency and hope. We've established how chaotic and deeply varied the mind is. But we aren't just helpless passengers trapped in whatever baseline brain genetics handed us, are we? We have the capacity to deliberately hack the architecture.
We absolutely do. While our baseline internal experience, whether we are visual, verbal, or silent, is largely cemented by early development, genetics, and structural brain layout, we possess neuroplasticity. We can deliberately alter how our brain processes and stores information through rigorous training.
And what's the best example of that?
The most powerful, scientifically verified example of this hacking is the method of loci, also commonly known as the memory palace.
I am familiar with the concept. This is the parlor trick you see memory champions use, where they memorize the exact order of a shuffled deck of cards by imagining themselves walking through their childhood home and placing a giant vivid image of each card in a different room.
It is often dismissed as a trick, but it is actually a profound manipulation of neural pathways. It's an ancient mnemonic strategy dating all the way back to the orders of the Greek and Roman empires. But the underlying reason it is so devastatingly effective goes right back to what we discussed earlier about the visual brain. It leverages our evolutionary premise. Remember, the dorsal visual stream.
The where pathway, the part of the brain responsible for spatial memory and mapping the environment.
Precisely. From an evolutionary standpoint, human beings did not evolve to remember long lists of abstract, non-spatial data like telephone numbers, complex passwords, or grocery lists. Our ancestors survived by evolving an incredibly robust spatial memory system. They needed to remember exactly where the poisonous plants were, where the watering hole was, and the complex three-dimensional layout of the hunting terrain.
So how does the method of loci use that?
The method of loci hacks the modern brain by taking non-spatial abstract data, translating it into visual imagery, and forcing it into that ancient, highly overpowered spatial memory system. You trick the brain into treating a grocery list like a map of survival terrain.
You translate the abstract into the spatial? But how effective is this software patch, objectively? Like, what are the numbers?
Researchers at Stanford University conducted a landmark study to test exactly how far this hack could push human biology. They gathered a group of world-class memory athletes, the kind of people who can memorize tens of thousands of digits of pi, and a group of what they called naive controls. These were just normal, everyday people with completely average baseline memories.
Let's look at the specific methodology and the numbers from this Stanford data, because the results are wild.
They started by giving everyone a baseline test, a list of 72 entirely random words to memorize in a short time frame. The baseline average recall for a normal untrained person was about 40 out of the 72 words. The memory athletes, actively utilizing their spatial memory palaces, hit roughly 71 out of 72 words, near perfect recall.
So there is a massive performance gap. Normal people at 40, elite athletes at 71.
Then the researchers took the naive controls and gave them a highly targeted 6-week training regimen in the loci method, just teaching them the mechanics of how to build a mental memory palace and how to encode abstract words into vivid, bizarre visual images to place inside it.
And they had control groups.
To ensure scientific rigor, they also had an active control group that spent 6 weeks doing standard, repetitive working memory exercises and a passive control group that did absolutely nothing.
And after 6 weeks of training the software, what did the hardware do?
The results were undeniable. The active working memory controls, the ones doing standard brain training puzzles, improved barely at all, moving from 40 words to about 42 out of 72. The passive controls stayed firmly at 40. But the naive controls, who learned the spatial loci method, they completely bridged the gap.
They matched the memory athletes.
They matched the world-class memory athletes. They went from recalling 40 words to hitting roughly 71 out of 72 words.
Wait, I want to emphasize this. Normal, average people effectively became memory savants in a month and a half, just by consciously changing the internal software routine they use to process the incoming data.
Yes. In standard clinical testing metrics, this spatial hack yields a performance ratio we designate mathematically as RNOM, which is approximately 1.77. But in subjective, real-world application, these newly trained individuals consistently report their functional memory capacity increasing by 5 to 10 times its original baseline.
That is genuinely mind-blowing, but what is physically happening inside their skulls? Are they just learning a clever psychological workaround, or are they actually physically changing the biological architecture we've been discussing this whole time?
They are physically changing the architecture. Neuroplasticity in action. The Stanford researchers put these naive controls back into the fMRI scanner after the 6 weeks of training, and they looked at their resting state functional connectivity, the fundamental baseline electrical wiring of their brain when they aren't even actively performing a memory task.
And what did the scans show?
The fMRI scans revealed that their brains had physically rewired to resemble the brains of the world-class memory athletes. Specifically, the researchers observed profound, measurable changes in 71 distinct brain regions intricately tied to memory and visuospatial processing.
The brain recognized that the new operating system was vastly more efficient, and it literally relayed the physical cable to optimize it.
And crucially, this massive biological rewiring was sustained 4 full months later, even without the subjects engaging in continuous, heavy practice. It proves that we are not entirely at the mercy of our default architecture. We can deliberately, consciously reorganize our cognitive operating system by leaning into our older, more powerful visual pathways.
We have covered an immense amount of territory today. We have mapped the heavy metabolic tax of the inner voice, the cinematic projection of the mind's eye, the naked reality of pure concepts, the psychedelic blending of synesthesia, the profound emotional cost of a wandering mind, and finally, how to physically rewire our own memory.
It's a lot to process.
But I want to bring all of this high-level neuroscience back down to the ground. Because understanding this isn't just about collecting interesting trivia. The interpersonal, societal implications of these invisible universes colliding are massive.
They govern almost every friction point in society. The most significant barrier we face as a species is what psychologists formally term the false consensus effects.
You mentioned that earlier.
Right. It is the stubborn, almost unbreakable biological assumption that other people process reality, language, and emotion in the exact same format that we do. And when these invisible internal mismatches inevitably occur, societal structures break down.
Give me a concrete example of how this breaks down in daily domestic life.
Think about the most basic communication gaps. Imagine a husband who is a highly verbal, linear thinker. He is trying to give his wife, who possesses a heavily hyperfantastic visual mind, directions to a new restaurant across town. He naturally gives her a linear linguistic list of data. Go 3 miles down the highway, turn left at the 3rd stoplight, and head north.
What does her brain do with that?
Her visual brain struggles to process that sequential string of abstract data. What her operating system required was a spatial map, a vivid description of visual landmarks. They end up in a frustrating argument in the car, not because either of them is unintelligent or obstinate, but because their fundamental operating systems are incompatible without translation.
We see this exact same friction magnified 1,000 times over in education, don't we?
Educational barriers are incredibly rampant and deeply systemic. Our entire modern school system is largely designed by and optimized for verbal, linear thinkers. Teachers naturally explain complex concepts sequentially, step by step, using language.
But a visual, holistic student, someone with an architecture similar to Temple Grandin, might completely fail to grasp the sequential steps.
Exactly. They need to see the entire, finished, three-dimensional concept first, before they can reverse engineer and understand the individual steps. If the teacher falsely assumes the student thinks in words, that student inevitably gets left behind, frustrated, and falsely labeled as slow or inattentive.
And the limits this puts on medical and psychological therapy are just as concerning.
Absolutely. Think about a standard baseline therapy session designed to treat severe trauma or clinical anxiety. A very common, widely taught grounding technique is for the therapist to instruct the patient. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and picture your safe space. Visualize a calm, empty beach. See the waves, feel the sun.
If that patient happens to be part of the roughly 4% of the population living with hypophantasia or complete aphantasia, that clinical instruction is medically useless.
It is deeply frustrating and highly alienating. The therapist is trying to run a visual software program that the patient's brain simply does not have installed on the hard drive.
We have to fundamentally shift our cultural understanding. We have to realize that cognitive variations, whether it's the blindness of aphantasia, the silence of an endophasia, or the abstraction of unsymbolized thinking, these are not deficits. They are not diseases to be cured.
They are just the vast, beautiful, natural spectrum of human consciousness.
They represent the incredible multiplicity of our internal universes. The structural variation inside human minds perfectly matching the immense diversity of external human culture.
Well said.
And that leads me to a final lingering thought that I want to leave you with today. We've talked about how isolated these universes are, but technology is rapidly approaching a point where that isolation might end. Companies are currently developing brain-computer interfaces, neural implants designed to link the human brain directly to machines and eventually to each other.
It's coming faster than we think.
If we ever reach a point where we can artificially link our minds, what happens when the invisible walls come down? What happens when a hyper-fantastic visual thinker downloads the silent, raw data thoughts of an endophasic? Will our brains be able to translate that alien code, or will the sudden exposure to a completely different operating system break our own? Will we finally understand each other, or will we just realize how terrifyingly alien we truly are?
It's a profound question.
The next time you are sitting in a room with a friend, a partner, or a colleague in total silence, remember that you are sitting next to an entirely different universe. The silence you hear might be a booming, evaluative monologue for them. The blank wall you see might be a vivid, full-color cinematic projection for them. You will never truly know what it feels like to be inside their mind. The only life you truly live and the only universe you will ever fully explore is the one inside your own head. Thank you for joining this session of Audio Notebook.